someone turned the volume down on one of the biggest cities on Earth, Guangzhou, 20 million people in southern China, where the Pearl River meets the South China Sea. Midsummer, 36 degrees, hundreds of thousands of vehicles on the road, and almost no sound. 2 out of 3 cars here run on electricity, green license plates everywhere. Dozens of Chinese brands you have never heard of. The world's largest energy transition did not start in Brussels, Berlin, or Washington. It started here. In 2025, something happened for the first time in human history. More electricity was generated from wind, sun, and water than from coal. According to the latest global power statistics, renewables reached roughly 34% of total electricity production that year. China drove more than half of that growth. In solar power alone, Chinese plants produced around 1,175 terawatt-hours of electricity, more than the United States, India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, Spain, Australia, Italy, and South Korea combined. On one side of the ledger, that is a climate story. On the other, it is an industrial story about who builds the machines that run the transition. And China is not only building for itself. In the southwest of Hungary, the mayor of Kaposvár stood in front of a new electric bus and called it a historic day. His city would be the first in Hungary to run entirely on electric buses. At the same time, he opened one of the country's biggest solar parks, advertised as enough to power around 50,000 homes. The buses were built by a Chinese manufacturer. The panels came from JA Solar, China. The company that developed the park was Genertech, China General Technology Group, a state-owned enterprise. That pattern repeats across continents. Solar fields in India the size of a European city like Hamburg. Wind parks in Ethiopia and Nigeria. Pakistan multiplying its solar share within a few years because, on the spreadsheet, the economics work. Between 2024 and 2025, Chinese solar exports to Africa rose by roughly 50%, according to trade data, not because of a charity program, but because the panels are cheap and reliable. China builds at home, and it sells the tools of the transition abroad. Here is the problem Europe cannot escape. For decades, the continent depended on Russian oil and gas. The invasion of Ukraine exposed that vulnerability in real time. As Europe accelerates towards clean energy, it is stepping into a new dependency: Chinese technology, Chinese minerals, and Chinese supply chains. Wind turbines, solar panels, and EV batteries all depend on rare earth elements and processed minerals: lithium, cobalt, neodymium. China does not just mine a share of them, it refines the large majority of the world's supply, regardless of where the raw material was extracted. A mine in Australia or Chile can still end up feeding a Chinese refinery before the material becomes usable industrial input. That refining bottleneck is what turns a resource question into a dependency question. European solar manufacturers, including names like Meyer Burger in Germany, have been crushed by imports. Factories shut down, installation numbers keep rising, but with Chinese panels, Chinese inverters, and often Chinese capital, European workers are left to drill the holes and mount the hardware, while the industrial value sits somewhere else. Oxford professor Jan Rosenau, who advises the European Commission and the World Bank on energy policy, put it this way: "The window is closing. Are we wasting it?" The window he is talking about is the chance to build a European clean energy industry before Chinese companies lock in the supply chains for good. Then comes the security layer. Solar inverters, the devices connecting panels to the grid, can communicate with servers outside Europe, including in China. In principle, they can be switched off remotely. This is not a hypothetical vulnerability unique to solar. The same logic applies to any grid-connected hardware running on remotely updatable software, which is why the transit and energy sectors have both become live test cases for the same underlying question: who controls the off switch on infrastructure another country builds and maintains? In 2025, Norway's transit authority Ruter ran what they called a lion cage test on electric buses outside Oslo, in the town of Sandvika. Investigators found that the Chinese-built Yutong bus had remote access capability via a SIM card from a Romanian provider, allowing over-the-air software updates and, in principle, remote control. A Dutch-built VDL bus tested in parallel did not have that capability. That is not a Hollywood cyber plot. It is simply how modern fleets and grids are designed, and a reminder of who sits at the other end of the connection. A leaked report by the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies raised a similar concern at sea. It warned that planned Chinese-made offshore wind turbines in German waters near the island of Borkum could, in theory, use onboard sensors to track the movements of German naval vessels. 16 turbines by Chinese manufacturer Mingyang are involved in that warning. The investor behind the project is Luxcara. A government spokesperson, Stefan Hebestreit, confirmed that the report is under review. The report itself is not public, and the risk is still being debated. But the underlying problem is the same. If your critical infrastructure is built with another country's hardware and software, you have to ask not just where the electricity comes from, but who can see what that infrastructure sees, and who can turn it off. As Europe races into renewables, it is moving through China. So what is the alternative? Many voices in Europe point to nuclear energy. No Chinese supply chains, no gas dependency, no problem when the wind stops blowing. France has long been Europe's nuclear champion. Roughly 70% of its electricity comes from reactors. But its attempt at a new generation of plants tells a different story. Flamanville 3, which finally went commercial in late 2024, was originally budgeted at around 3 billion euros. It ended up costing roughly 13 billion and took about 16 years to build. The United Kingdom's Hinkley Point C project is following a similar path. These are not isolated miscalculations. They are part of a pattern that has repeated across almost every Western attempt to build new generation reactors this century. Skills lost after decades without new construction, first-of-a-kind engineering problems that only show up once you start building, and regulatory systems designed for older technology that few people in the current workforce have ever actually implemented. Small modular reactors are sold as the fix. Cheaper, faster, easier to deploy. The European Commission has launched an SMR strategy with a dedicated funding window and optimistic capacity projections for 2050. A companion technical report sketches out between 17 and 53 gigawatts of SMR capacity across the EU by mid-century. On paper, it looks neat. In reality, worldwide, only 2 SMRs are in commercial operation, one in China, one in Russia. Scaling that technology across an entire continent within a decade, amid cost uncertainty, complex regulation, and public resistance, looks less like a concrete plan and more like a projection. Poland is building its first nuclear plant with American Westinghouse technology, partly to avoid depending on Russia or China. But even that project is unlikely to deliver electricity before the late 2030s. Germany, after shutting down its last 3 reactors in April 2023, would need at least 15 years to come back, and the political path is blocked. Nuclear may well play a role in Europe's long-term mix. It just does not arrive in time to solve the dependency problem this decade, which brings us back to the core dilemma. Europe is moving away from fossil fuels that left it exposed to petrostates like Russia and to the volatility of the Middle East. But the faster it moves, the deeper it runs into Chinese supply chains in energy technology. There is no clean exit, only a choice between dependencies. Staying with fossil fuels means staying exposed to the decisions of oil and gas exporters and to price shocks you cannot control. Racing into renewables means relying on Chinese hardware, Chinese minerals, and, in some cases, Chinese off-switches built into the grid. Nuclear appears on paper as a third path. In practice, for the next 10 to 15 years, it mostly changes the timeline, not the basic question. The world's largest energy transition did not start in Brussels. It started in places like Guangzhou, and Europe now has to decide what it is willing to depend on in order to catch up.